Welcome to the Police Free Campus podcast. I'm your host, Charles H.F. Davis III, and we are thankful to be joined in conversation today by comrades and colleagues working to reimagine post-secondary institutions in a world without police. First, I'd like to welcome Brenda Anderson Wadley, a doctoral student and student affairs professional at the University of Arizona, and a visiting doctoral fellow here at the Campus Abolition Research Lab. Brenda's work focuses on the role of higher education as a legitimizing force for carceral society, racial inequities in higher education policing, and student organized resistance for police-free campuses. We're also joined by Dr. Jude Dizon, an assistant professor of higher education and student affairs at Rutgers Graduate School of Education and lead author of the report Campus Policing, a guide for higher education leaders. Dr. Dizon's work examines the relationship between the carceral state and higher education to include the college-prison nexus, disparities in campus policing, and the role of policing in perpetuating race, gender, and class inequality in higher education. Comrades, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks for having us, Charles.
My pleasure. So I want to start with sort of our both collective and individual entries into this work. I can imagine for a number of listeners, the question is like, how do you even get involved in studying something like policing, given all the ways we understand the traditional domains of higher education? And so I'm wondering for you all, if you could speak a bit about what shaped your journey in the study of policing and carcerality in higher education and why it's an important site of study and struggle for us as a field. And maybe Brenda, we'll start with you and then Jude will come to you.
Thank you for that question. I think my entry point was first as someone who experienced time in the foster care system growing up, and then also identify as a first generation college student. And so always really being skeptical of like the ways that systems and policies impact folks, and seeing that not only in my lived experience as a, child, but also as an adult on a college campus. And really thinking and being fed this piece that like college campuses were safe, right? And then walking on there and seeing these same types of systems that I saw in my community be perpetuated and also be seen as normal. I also think that in my experience as a student affairs practitioner, I started off as a case manager. And so in that, right, we really focus a lot on what does it look like to care and support students, especially students who are experiencing extenuating circumstances. And I really started to see that the way that the word care and support really started to become interchangeable for the word surveil. And so I would sit on these assessment teams, right, for behavioral intervention teams, and I would literally be sitting here with student affairs practitioners, but also see cops present, right? But the thing that I would see is the cops weren't necessarily there, right, to provide support, but actually re-legitimize surveillance and the belief that students were inherently harmful, angry, right, and in needing of like, let's just name it, being put into systems. I think my waking up moment in higher education was around the Trump election. Being a case manager in the state of Arizona and, seeing the high level of cases and the high level of needs around students and support, but seeing the way that UAPD here on campus at the University of Arizona also started to bring in FBI agents, right? And so I think that that was another piece of being situated next to the borderlands, because Tucson is right next to the US-Mexico border, that the university had these different systems that were used to not only surveil students based on, right, was their incident or their extenuating circumstance rise to the level of legal action, but also the ways that that then became around a race, gendered, and sexualized, even further phenomenon in terms of the surveillance. And so we saw that really, well, I saw that and I experienced that. And I remember I would go and try to be in conversations with my supervisor at the time about, hey, like, don't we have shared values around, students and support? And I really saw how the actions really weren't aligned. And then being a confidential survivor advocate, I saw the same thing, how surveillance and care really became interchangeable. The ways that, we would really rely on the legal system for safety and support, but the ways that students actually experienced that really situated them in this apparatus where universities, quote unquote, utilize these resources, but what ended up happening is students were most likely to, drop out of school time and time again, or have to withdraw out of classes. And so we would say, oh, these are the support systems that we have, but then those support systems wouldn't necessarily provide care or safety. It would just be a mechanism of surveillance. I think it's really, really important because what I've seen, especially after the murder of George Floyd, was this huge, huge call from higher education institutions of we need racial equity, we need social justice, and these real claims around what justice looks like, but that action was not necessarily there. And then now what we're seeing is that a lot of those positions or those commitments that were made are actually being retracted. So those, diversity and inclusion positions that were created, or those initial commitments to racial justice have been retracted, and universities have actually been able to get away with not utilizing action to actually meet those commitments that they've made. We've also seen this be parallel with the legal system, particularly with decisions in the Supreme Court, and how that really trickles down and impacts students that we work with. I also will name that as a student affairs practitioner, when I would be in conversations with folks and would have conversations around policing, it felt like the Thanksgiving dinner table, right? And not necessarily the Thanksgiving dinner table when you're just with your families, but it's like the weird uncle or a cousin's or like family's house that you would show up to and your parents be like, wait, remember, don't talk about that. But the situation wasn't necessarily that folks didn't want to talk about it. It became the situation where I felt like what ended up happening is we have been socialized to believe that cops on our college campuses are the only way that we can be safe. But then we see movements time and time again through organizing and struggles where students have actually pushed back and said, hey, we actually keep us safe. But instead, because we've been socialized and we truly have been bought into this lie that this is the only way to keep students safe, then what essentially I saw ended up happening, and I continue to see happen, is there's value how am I trying to say this? There was values incongruency, but also this continual legitimization because of the ways that policy, capitalism, as well as a need for power would show up. And so behind closed doors, right, it would be, oh, I would never ever call the cops on the student. I would never ever believe X, Y, and Z. Oh, I've been engaging in, some of the scholars that we've been in conversation with, right? Maryam Kaba, all of these well-known scholars, but then in the day-to-day practice, they would continue to legitimize by leading out the policy and be okay with it and say, well, it's my job. And so that also became a disjuncture for me. And I think that as an organization in a professional field, we really are, I think folks say, oh, well, higher education is a microcosm of what society is. But I think that we actually are a big mirror and stand behind titles or, fancy institutions as a way to, push back about this idea that oh, we're not actually, perpetuating the same harm of, what we see in society, but in reality, we actually do. And so my hope and why I'm committed to this work is that I grew up a dreamer. I grew up a dreamer, not only with my siblings, but in my community, thinking about what would a new future look like. And I think that that's something as a professional that I could never leave behind. And so dreaming is something that keeps me excited. And I strongly do dream of campuses that are police free, that are not relying upon policies and procedures that really make students responsible for the harm that institutions cause them. And so those are just some of the things that I think bring me to the work. And I hope that made sense. I'm wearing my retainer, so I'm going to take it out, but yeah.
Yeah, so you said a lot of helpful things, and we're going to come back to various points there. And Jude, I want to bring you in here. Brenda talks about sort of this socialization, right, that happens generally, I think, in society as we understand, but also your experience talks about this socialization and training of student affairs professionals that was really emblematic of how you even came to understand that this was an issue, much less the thing that you decided to study. Could you talk a bit about that experience?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. And yeah, Brenda, thanks so much for just opening us up with lots of thought-provoking insight. I think personally for me, I identify as a Filipino from an immigrant family. from a working class family, and I grew up in a predominantly working class Latinx neighborhood that all my life growing up was, stigmatized as, a criminalized area, and that had a lot of police presence. And so, for me, it's been an interesting journey with recognizing my own, I guess, limitations in how I analyze social problems. And so, in short, while I've had for a long time a critique of policing out in the community, right, municipal police, it took a while for me to really turn that attention to campus police at the university. And so for myself as well, I've had a career in student affairs, working full-time for 5 years as a professional, specifically in multicultural affairs roles. And the turning point for me was in 2014. So to remind folks, that 2014, Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, and that's initiated months-long community uprising against anti-Black violence and police violence. And, that really catapulted, Black Lives Matter, into our national discourse, and really motivated a lot of college students to take action as well. And that was true for myself at the campus that I was at the time. And, I was very fortunate to have learned a lot from undergraduate students of color that I had been advising through my role in the Multicultural Center. And as they engaged in campaigns to demilitarize the campus, to create more transparency with the university police, that is what really got me to realize that I had this disconnected analysis between policing, again, out in the community and the policing on campus. And it made me realize that I had never questioned the ways in which myself as a student affairs professional was socialized to work alongside campus police. So as Brenda mentioned, behavioral intervention teams or threat assessment teams, though these are entities that bring together campus police with student affairs professionals, all in the name under this common goal of student safety or student well-being. Yet, these are folks who have very different orientations, training, and approaches to their work. And so, I think I just realized, wow, how am I being complicit with campus police, but also being critical of the police? And I realized that it just disturbed me, quite frankly, that I had this inattention, so to speak. And so, learning from students and walking with them in this journey, that really stayed with me and began to shape my thinking. And so, in terms of my research, then I was really interested to think about and push myself, how am I advocating for racial justice on our college campuses, right? The work I was doing was advising students, programming, leadership development, all of which, of course, is very positive and helpful. But then I'm realizing, well, they're becoming leaders within a campus in which they can easily be harmed legitimately by someone who works with the university. They can be arrested, they can be detained, they could be killed even. And I kind of was not thinking about that all the time and was not doing anything about it. And so, for me, I became curious, well, what is there in the literature about this? And, in brief, for me, it's been very surprising to kind of have realized that, within our committed line of research on racism in higher ed, the campus police have been this neglected entity of focused analysis. And while there is literature on campus policing, not much of that is from, a criminological or criminal justice, from the field of criminal justice, which really hasn't been paying attention to issues of race and other social dynamics. And so, I think fortunately or unfortunately, I could see this need for research to really inform, in the higher education field, how we think about campus police, and kind of disrupt what I see as a crime control rationale in higher ed, that essentially there's this notion of campus crime, which in itself is not interrogated as to the meaning of that and how crime is constructed. But that there's, this belief that there's crime and violence out there, and that police then are the only solution. Yet there's very little evidence of the effectiveness of campus police in doing what they are believed to do, which one is an issue, given, another discourse of evidence-based practices, data-driven decision-making in higher ed. So there's actually a lack of evidence to show the need for campus police. And secondly, I think campus leaders really now need to really think about how to reconcile values of, quote, diversity, equity, and inclusion with then campus safety, as I think certainly for sure the last going on 3 years now have shown us that there are discrepancies between how campuses prioritize these different goals.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jude and Brenda. Jude, you're reminding me of sort of my own trajectory and story into the issues of policing, in part so much thinking about my work as an organizer and activist that was really situated like in community, and especially, during my time in LA with LAPD and its, torrid history of violence. And I remember that distinctive moment sort of in that summer of 2020, where obviously George Floyd is killed, and there's so many other examples. And it was kind of the first moment for me that it clicked to be asking the questions that I'm asking in this broader sociopolitical world about higher education, which kind of led to my phone call to you of just like, I know you're the person that's doing this. You have so much expertise on understanding of this in higher ed. Maybe together we might be able to achieve something, that would be of use at that moment. And then that sort of opened up the possibility of what it would mean to be able to understand what is this sort of symbiosis that happens, right? We sort of understand that school produces society and society produces school, and much could be said about how higher education factors into that, that then led to all these questions, to your point, of not just even campus police specifically, but like all the ways in which we're engaging in surveillance and control and punishment and domination in this sector, but also the ways that institutions are like deeply intertwined with law enforcement agencies in terms of like how we're training and developing people, right? We know that that was certainly happening, at our institution and a number of institutions for those who maybe are looking to go up the ranks or in managerial positions, but that we're actually facilitating the production of like law enforcement professionals that, for obviously financial reasons, becomes a lucrative sort of industry that also needs to be pushed back and interrogated. And so in thinking about that and sort of the conversation around carcerality, I want to return back to you, Jude, and your work with our colleague Royal Johnson about this thing that you all describe as the college prison nexus. And so I'm wondering, could you sort of describe what that is for readers, and how does it help us rethink the relationship of higher education to what other scholars like Erica Miners and a number of others that we know of what they describe as the carceral state?
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so I think in that piece, for me, I think part of our contribution was one to really extend the great work, by K-12 scholars and also K-12 community advocates and very committed parents and community members to disrupt, what has been called the school to prison pipeline, what maybe now, what is not, and which is now being more so referred to the school to prison nexus. And essentially, it's and this notion that students of color, oftentimes Black, Latinx students, low-income students, are being funneled out of school into the prison system, right? And I think that's where that analysis began, in this linear fashion from school to the prison. And the notion of the nexus has helped to elevate a nuance and help us all recognize the ways in which K-12 schools are themselves, right, sites of punishment and violence, and themselves can be prison-like spaces. And also how students are just harmed in general by contact with the carceral state, even if they may not eventually be arrested or incarcerated. And for me, it was again interesting to think about, well, why is this being confined to just a K-12 sector? And what about colleges and universities? Why do they seem to be exempt and seen as exceptional sites where possibly then such violence does not occur? And of course, again, I think when we just look at what is around us, right? Colleges and universities are police. There is surveillance, there are cameras, there are systems to punish students, right? Municipal law enforcement also collaborates with universities as well. Students are also punished as well through student conduct and so on. And so while it may look different, certainly these forms of punishment are there. And so this conceptual piece and this notion of the college prison nexus include higher ed and kind of disrupt this exceptional status of the university, right? Something that I think about is college. For me, coming again from an immigrant working class family, as the first to go to college, I was told college is a path to a better life, and that could be true. But again, that kind of idea, which I think is prevalent, mask the reality that college can also be a place where you can be harmed as well, right? Where you may not have a chance for a better life because of the systematized violence that could occur for a student. And so essentially the article attempts to conceptualize and put forth and call and invite folks into a research agenda to think about the ways in which logics of punishment show up. So in one sense, the college prison nexus, we can conceptualize that in three different components. One, what logics of punishment can we identify through policies and practices, in colleges and universities? Secondly, what are the formal connections and formal partnerships that colleges and universities have with the carceral state, such as, policing, prisons, the military also, I would add. And then thirdly, as well, what are the financial, and I think relatedly to these formal partnerships, in what ways do universities and colleges profit off the carceral state as well? So the use of prison labor created products, for example, or Charles, as you mentioned, the tuition dollars that come from, law enforcement preparation type programs or contracts with police departments to train police officers and so on. And so, I think that piece was a starting point. And I would really hope that folks, I do encourage folks to read that, to really take up the idea, wrestle with it, challenge what we've written, but also add to the idea then and help refine it and sharpen it. And also could do that hard work of collecting empirical data, because I think the difference, I think, between studying law enforcement in the municipal sector versus the campus sector is that there is not the same kind of data reporting and databases where we can do, like, let's say, statistical analyses of campus police contact by race, for example. That does not exist for higher education currently. And so there's a big need to do the conceptualization and then to find, the data to help us see how it shows up, in reality.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jude. So much of what you're talking about, and Brenda, I think this attaches to sort of your commentary and story as well, right? Is this sort of idea that was first introduced by Foucault and has been taken up by folks like Carla Shedd, of sort of this carceral continuum, right? And all the ways that we might think about, and it's also absent from the discourse and conversation of, for folks who have been justice involved or system involved, that they arrive to campus, right, and then sort of see the exact same things that they saw in a space that is espoused to be somewhat different, right, or provide a different access to opportunity, or even perhaps be considered somewhat more safe. And so as you're talking about sort of like these structures, right, and these arrangements of structures that create this college prison nexus, Brenda, I want to turn to you and thinking about your understanding of like process, right, and the sort of like ways that institutions legitimize the carceral state. And so you recently presented a paper at the Associate for Study of Higher Education conference, what we call ASH, colloquially here, that sort of looks at these like policies and practices, right, and the ways that this has happened. I wonder, could you share a bit of sort of your analysis in that paper, and maybe an example of what you mean when you describe what you've called the campus safety apparatus and sort of its role in establishing legitimacy for policing and incarceration?
Yes. Also, I have the most amazing co-author, you, on that paper. I think that paper came about working at the University of Arizona and seeing the uprise of different student organizing movements. And one of the things that we've seen time and time again is when these incidents happens, the ways that the university responds is more around doubling down on the need for policing and surveilling instead of actually thinking about student safety and concern, right? I also just want to say that student organizing is leadership development. And I want to say it again because I think that one of the pieces is being a professional and moving through different managerial positions. You come in conversation with folks who are tasked with leading out these different policies and practices, but when it's framed around student organizing or students who are impacted by social and political issues in a particular type of way, it becomes this, what ends up happening is that racial formations end up happening, as well as the university creates this narrative around who's an actual student and then who is someone who actually shouldn't be on our campus and kind of just like slid their way in. And I've seen grown professionals talk about student organizing in that way. And when I actually talk about, wait, student organizing is leadership development, folks pause and they're like, And I'm like, yeah, can you imagine like having to rally around like a large movement and keep it sustainable? And the entry point for that paper was similarly thinking about the way this is at the University of Arizona responded to the Arizona 3 incident, which is public knowledge, particularly around students resisting Border Patrol presence on our campus. And the way that the university responded And then not even a year later, with the uprising after the murder of George Floyd, and student organizers coming around and putting on a display, and the president saying, hey, we won't have cop presence. But then in reality, what ended up happening is we had a large militarized campus and police presence, right? And so really retracting on that and again doubling down. And I think that the way that the university doubled down was through what we presented at ASH is a critical discourse analysis of the university. What came out of that, they brought in some consultings who really thought about this idea of reimagining campus police. I like to say you can't reimagine police. Policing as a structure is racist, and there's one goal, and the goal is literally to surveil and to push folks out of displacement. So my thought around what the campus safety apparatus is and what it does is the campus safety apparatus is really those policies and procedures. And in this case, it was an example of this 32-page report that was all about these promises that the university was going to do in terms of their processes to reimagine campus police. But in reality, what ended up happening in that paper, and it's public knowledge, and it will be published soon, is that the university again created these racial formations of different students. And the purpose of that was for the university to appear to the public good that they were actually meeting student demands, right? That they were engaging in these conversations, but ended up happening is you literally read the report and the report is like, but at the end of the day, like we need cops because cops keep us safe. And so when that apparatus is happening, what it does is it situates students in this very, very particular way. And I know I mentioned it earlier, right, about this idea that what happens is students become responsible for the violence that they experience.
Mm-hmm.
And the institution says, wait, we didn't do that, right? That's just, and we actually saw this at the University of Arizona, and another piece of some of the communication that we've been gathering around campus responses to police. Our president responded with another incident that recently happened, and said that, and this is a email that went out to 70 plus people, said that students particularly are responsible. Marginalized students face barriers that are unique to them, right? These barriers are not about what the university does to them. It's about what they face because it's unique to their personhood. So this idea of perpetuating anti-Black racism, xenophobia, transphobia, because if you, right, come from a marginalized community, the barriers that you're facing are just about, your personhood. It has nothing to do with the time and time again that, again, the university doubles down and doesn't think about campus safety and concern, but instead says, we need these policies, we need these procedures because they keep us safe. In reality, students get pushed out. They don't graduate, right? They take on student loan debt, they take on, the trauma that they experience. And I've seen time and time again the ways that instead of graduating with degrees or, being able to, move into society, students actually end up becoming harmed even further. For me, I see it as, again, not only an extension of the carceral state, but this legitimacy for how policies and procedures aren't necessarily created with centering those who actually have to live through those policies and procedures, but really about how do we create policies and procedures as an extension to surveilled. So if you aren't necessarily able to be functioning because of the way that this policy and procedure may become a race gendered, sorry, let me back up a little bit. If you aren't able to get through these different barriers, right, then maybe you shouldn't be a student here. Because if the common good is saying we need policing, right, we need this presence, then you're the issue. And then students then become framed as the issue, and everyone else over here is having a good time except you. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, to your earlier point, right, and Jude, I'm gonna bring you back in here, that much of what you just shared is not dissimilar for how we sort of treat this idea of delinquency, right, in society, certainly emergent from both sociological and criminal justice literature, that it's sort of on the individual, right? Like they are responsible for their own delinquence or maladjustment in a society that has not held or made space for them. And we don't talk about that enough. And a lot of literature in higher ed really talks about, right, similarly, individual levels of responsibility, where more critical scholars have said, well, what's the institution's responsibility, right? Like if you've admitted a student who you were, taking hard-earned tuition dollars from, or many of whom, right, of us are taking out loans and coming into debt for, what is the responsibility of the institution to make sure that they are safe, right? Certainly, and we talked about this in another episode with some organizers from the Cops Off Campus Coalition, but sort of this idea that like the campus might be like very secure as, emblematic of the policing, but not necessarily safe. And we sort of started to talk about all the ways in which safety can and should be understood, and that one, police are not keeping, those of us who are marginalized safe for sure, but there's so many other elements of safety that are not even being considered in our broader conversation. And Jude, I know with your work that has looked at, sort of the racialized policing practices and disparities in police interactions, how is what Brenda's talking about sort of aligned with the findings that you have from some of your earlier work?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think a neglected aspect of safety, of course, is thinking about how students of color experience the campus racial climate, for example, and also how students, but also how do local community members, I think, also relate to the university as well. I'm thinking about students who also may be from the local community or identify with the local community just around a university. How are they also feeling safe and able to traverse the campus border? I think, for myself, in terms of my research and what I've found, is that, I think unsurprisingly, campus policing reinforces racialized understandings of students, and as well, that intersects also with gender and class, of course. And so, for example, in the study that I just kind of completed to finish my doctorate, there were what I identified as these common narratives shared among students, staff, and faculty around who policing was there to target and who police were there to protect. And so essentially there was agreement that police were there to target folks who identified who were racialized as Black, Latinx, viewed as being poor or unhoused, and essentially not of the university. And then in terms of the converse, being white, potentially being read as affluent, also that this was a protected class of folks at the university who police, maybe relax sometimes their standards around surveilling as folks entered and crossed through the campus. And I think, to me, I think the larger, implication is that policing does contribute to the campus racial climate, of course, and exacerbates the ways in which students of color already, as we know through research and loss of practitioner experience, right? How students already experience, for example, racial microaggressions in the classroom, exclusionary microenvironments all throughout the campus, in the residence halls, in social spaces, and so on. And so policing adds another layer of that, but with an added element, of course, of sanctioned force and violence that police officers are permitted to use. And also that administrators are sanctioned and allowed to call upon the police to use force against students or other folks that they deem to be unwanted or undesirable as well. And so I think, again, to me, I don't think that's necessarily, groundbreaking, but I think that is something we need to now really, I think, explicitly consider, that I think higher education leaders have been able to, for many years now, kind of neglect. Like they've been able to talk about safety from this race evasive lens and neglect the ways in which campus policing does contribute or can contribute to a very hostile, violent racial campus climate. And again, it just goes back to there's a real need right now for higher education leaders to reconcile these different values and priorities that they may say them all together, but the experiences, right, of vulnerable populations shows that there's a lot of contradiction in how those values are not being exercised.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you were talking, part of this was queuing in on sort of some things that we've discussed, but also thinking through of this like ecosystem in which policing is in some ways like less about specific officers or departments, but like this set of like practices and relationships in which people are expected to engage, right? Whether that's formally through this idea of like being a confidential reporter, right, of particular things that may happen on campus, and that sort of requisite as a part of your or condition, right, of your employment. But then also all the ways that like as has been said in sort of the literature, like cops live in folks' hearts and minds and like take it upon oneself as like a quote unquote good citizen of a community, right? To like, if you see something, say something. Well, like, what are we seeing? How do we understand whether that is perceived or understood to be a threat and in what context? And we've seen that a lot in a variety of institutions that are permissible to a number of things that are otherwise like unsafe or antagonistic towards a variety of students that we don't control for, but we are going to look out for, again, this sort of insider outsider, right, dynamic and try to enforce sometimes by way of boundaries, but also other sort of social cues that would suggest that one isn't supposed to be where they rightfully belong. We've seen some of that be evident in folks like DeMarcus Jenkins and Justin Coles and Antar Chavakunda's work around this, like, presence of the ID that is necessary to say, no, I'm supposed to be here, without even fully questioning, like in a context that presumably is open to the public, why is that even necessary? And so in thinking about these different pieces that you all have mentioned, I'm sure that, you've had these sort of common responses or retorts in public conversations about policing and certainly about abolition. And I'm wondering that folks listening, right, are going to kind of ask some of the same things about these challenges, these contradictions of policing in college university campuses. What might you all offer to practitioners and institutional leaders in order for them to like rethink these carceral approaches to campus safety, right? I think often folks are like, well, you're talking sort of at this abstract level, but are there like real practical things that we might be able to do that have been evidenced in your work and how you've thought about this and your own approaches as student affairs professionals, as people who consult and work with leaders, and folks who are writing about these topics?
I think if I could just start, I'll just kind of propose that, I think, folks in student affairs, which is of course my background, I think student affairs units, particularly, residential life, for example, should really do a thorough self-audit of all the various policies and procedures that are in place and really consider situation by situation, line by line, when is it necessary to have an armed officer, come into the residence halls? When is it necessary? Why is it necessary? And what should be the intended outcome, right? And also what could be the potential consequences as well, and forecasting both what could be what is supposed to be the benefit, but also what could be a harm. I think that there potentially is a lack of self-reflection and this explicit, thorough think through or analysis of procedure and policy and potential outcomes, that I think now is the time to really take that step back and evaluate, well, why are these policies in place? What is their purpose? And what good do they serve the students? Mm-hmm. I think for me, just for my own research, learning from resident assistants, undergraduates, they identified how there is a clear difference between how they are trained, right, from student affairs professionals from a student development lens, how they are trained to work with students in crises, and they observe the huge difference when then they are compelled or forced to call a campus police officer, and they see this campus police officer come at a student in crisis from a very different, from what I can gather, punitive, harsh, scary approach that for the resident assistant seems very much contradictory to how they've been taught, right, and the ethos of a residential life department. And so I think even if the undergraduates can see this and reflect on it, I think it is also incumbent upon professionals who can make structural organizational changes to also critically evaluate, right, this type of feedback and think through the consequences of their policies and practices. So I think certainly, I think student affairs, which is so interwoven through the university, and may oftentimes collaborate with campus police for these folks on the ground to, I think, be a first point of entry into revising and imagining new ways of working with students and how police should be involved. So I think, to me, that's a very tangible beginning step.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jude. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking just as recently as last month, right, we saw that national news story of the white student at the University of Kentucky who was intoxicated and disorderly and like hurling racist epithets at what I imagine was probably a residence director, at least someone who lived in the building, a Black woman who was there. And all I could think about in that initial instance was like, if police were called, who are they going to assume is the disorderly person, right? How might they engage with that? What questions will they or won't they ask? And thankfully, the sister ended up being okay, and that student has since been dismissed from the university. But there's so many other instances, right, in which like police are called even by Black folks, whether it's in society or even on campus, for support that were told, right, police are supposed to provide, and yet we're sort of engaged as like the people who are engaged in some level of criminal activity or causing the disruption, because there's that always already assumption, right, that like you're not supposed to be here anyway, and now you're acting out of character that we deem appropriate, even if it's not us. And then we could talk, obviously, right, about all the ways that alcohol and other drugs culture, right, and fraternity and sorority life and a bunch of other places at these big campuses is negligently addressed at all by folks who are supposed to really deal with those things, right, in any meaningful way.
Yeah, if I could actually add something. So, this notion of, calling the police, I think something that I've learned from my research, which also included interviewing campus police officers, one insight that was shared is that campus, these folks that I talked to discussed this issue of color bias and what they call transfer profiling, essentially to assert that they are not themselves proactively all the time looking for, racialized others, but that they are, mandated to address and respond to calls. So essentially, for me, I think one insight is that, the problems of racialized policing is not, of course, only the actions of the officers, but the folks who utilize them, which are also other members of the campus community. And so I think another tangible first step is for universities and colleges to create policies and I think create policies around how police should not be called upon just because someone looks at and sees, someone who looks different from them or who they think should not belong on campus, right? So similarly to how in San Francisco, for example, there was, I think, a proposal, I'm not sure if it was passed, but a proposal within San Francisco to basically, I think outlaw the racially biased calls to the SFPD. Right, in light of, also those cases that we've seen out in the community where white women typically have called the police on Black individuals for living their lives and doing everyday ordinary people things that people are allowed to do to live. And so I think similarly, universities and colleges could adopt that. If this is an issue, right, that exists on other campuses, and the police are responding to racially biased calls, and I think there should be policies to disrupt and intervene and eliminate that from happening on a college campus.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say even beyond that too, like the ways that this sort of legitimacy also is happening when those calls are made, when they put out these crime alerts, right? And they're like, oh, Black man between, 5 feet and 6'7", right? It's just like, well, that's anybody on this campus and for all intents and purposes. And I think about this a lot in the context of how we both racialize and code student athletes on campus, right? Just based on like apparel and like what they're wearing. But often how I hadn't thought about it before is maybe that in some ways does provide a certain level of a safety mechanism in so much as like, oh, we can like readily identify, again, knowing that many, big R1s and Division I institutions have 60 to 80% of their football teams and their men's basketball teams are Black, right? And so I think that too often is a part of like this way that there's this separation, right? This othering, right? Or the distinction between like, oh, these are the Black folks who are supposed to be here in so much as they serve, these particular purposes that are exploited by the institution. And everyone else is kind of like up for question if you're not in that particular uniform, which also then says, well, like, why do I have to do this to be performing this role of insider in a place, again, I rightfully belong, I'm paying tuition, I'm attending classes for. That is often, I know, a strategy that many students of color also use in certain campus environments. Like, no, let me make sure I'm wearing like visible, like student clothing, whatever that might mean, that distinguishes even me as an outsider, even if I'm from the neighborhood in which my institution is located. Brenda, I want to bring you in here and some additional things that you might be thinking about, again, that would inform practitioners, institutional leaders, even students about these types of approaches.
I think the first thing I would like to say is I wish I had done this earlier in my career. I think in student affairs, we're socialized into really thinking about our own literature as an entry point to thinking about like larger societal things that are happening. And I don't think that was something that I did prior to my master's program, but I think that I was socialized into it as I went through. And so I think about knowing, right, my own experiences with policing, as I shared earlier, growing up and what I witnessed in my community. And then my first semester in my PhD program, right, going to a conference where it was about the prison industrial complex in relationship to sexual violence, and really being like, wait, like this is a wake up call for me, because I essentially didn't want to be in one position because I was a mandated reporter. But then I got a confidentiality piece in front of my position title, but then perpetuated the same things. I am a huge proponent for abolishing this idea of mandated reporting on college campuses. I think that the way that it trickle downs and affects the workers who are tasked with leading out mandated reporting is that folks become the judge, the juror, right, the police officer. And it's really a nasty racialized project, right? Um, and we see it, and there are scholars who have talked about like what could be done outside of mandated reporting on college campuses. I think another piece that I think about is when folks enter the positions and we're taught about what it means to be a mandated reporter, we're now also thinking about problematizing the ways that we're essentially we are taking up this carceral role on a college campus by thinking through, okay, this is a law, right? And sometimes the things that are mandated aren't actually connected to a law. It's something that the institution has put into place. And I even have seen it as a confidential survivor advocate in relationship to the ways that RAs are a lot of the times the first students who are interacting with survivors of campus sexual violence. Because we know through research and what has been highlighted is that students aren't necessarily going to report to the confidential advocate on campus, they're having conversations with their friends. And so if our students are telling us something about the ways that policing and mandated reporting is trickling down and even impacting them, what does it look like to think about some of Dean Spade works of, trickle down activism, right? Are we centering students as a way to think through how we can rethink our systems and actually provide that care and safety to students that we essentially promise them? Because on any college campus, when students come on to campus for orientation or new student programming, what are the messaging that we're giving parents? What are the messaging that we're even giving students? Right. But then in reality, what ends up happening is professionals become stand-in cops, right? Stand-in police officers, stand-in judges. And so that is some of the things that I'm thinking about is number one, like how do we maybe leave the bounds of what we've been socialized in terms of literature and think outside of the box, right? So engage with Marim Kaba. I know recently I just got done reading Elite Capture, which is 40% off right now on Haymarket books. I would encourage folks to really think about that. And in that, it talks about how identity becomes a project and the way that the far right has used it, but I would also argue that we see it happening on college campuses. And I think that's important for our conversation today because the far right is also using policing as a way to think through, well, if we're not policing, then how do we sort through the good apples and the bad apples? So it becomes this idea of us versus them. And then also rethinking even how we think through policies such as mandated or confidential to really center, like, if students are telling us, right, we don't need committees, we just need to listen to students, those who are impacted the most in these policies and procedures.
Yeah, I think both of what you all are bringing is just so important, right? Of both sort of meeting this system and institution where it is and what we can kind of do in the immediate, but also being forward thinking and what we should be considering as the possibility of a different world, right? A different sort of space of police, and both of you speaking to all the ways in which the levels of deputization by the institution, but also self-deputization sort of results in this sort of concept that G. Omar talks about in his book, A World Without Police, what we call like the pig majority, right? Which essentially is like this sort of majoritarian population in the US that has a distinct investment in policing and carcerality, right? And it's like works to perpetuate that. And what that might mean in a campus where there's sort of this acute focus on police officers or police departments. And I can imagine a lot of professionals, faculty, staff included, try to create these distinctions, right? It's like, oh, it's big bad police, and not thinking about, well, what is my role in ensuring that that can be an institution that has a place here, right? That's validated and considered legitimate. We need to have more of a conversation about sort of that majoritarian position that most, I think, stakeholders on campus are either, again, deputized by the institution or take it upon themselves, right? Is like this good citizen work that really has, traumatic and irreparable effects for what people are experiencing, and some of which also then extends, as Jude mentioned, to right communities that are nearby. in thinking about these things, and as we wrap up, I think, one thing that's really helpful, and certainly sort of ideological and theoretical underpinning of our work at the lab, and this idea of a police-free campus being rooted in abolition. And so, naturally we draw from Ruth Wilson Gilmore's articulation of abolition. And so we always like to conclude our episodes with talking to our guests about how they interpret this concept of campus abolition as an exercise of reimagining higher education as a life-affirming institution. Brenda, you talked a little about this in the upfront, and Jude, you kind of alluded to it as well. So I'm wondering, given your experience, given your expertise, what might it look like, right, to have a police-free campus? Like, what do we imagine that to be? What things does it afford us? What possibilities exist as we sort of take up this idea of abolition in the context of higher and post-secondary education? And Jude, maybe I'll start with you, and then we'll transition to Brenda to close us out.
Sure. Yeah, I think, it's pretty expensive. And I would say that, for students, staff, faculty, administrators to feel that they are, quote unquote, safe on their campus, to me, I think not only does that mean that there's a reinvestment in higher education so that there are more than adequate finances, right, to ensure that student health, food, dining, housing, right, is available for members of the campus community, but also that the state, right, whether we're talking about the federal, state, or individual states, has also reinvested in social services, right, so that's the communities that surround universities are flourishing as well, right, that there is no need to fear, who is outside the campus gates, right, that our universities are both, right, microcosms or mirrors of society, but also are part of society as well, right? And how do we break down, to me, like, this notion of the ivory tower I think still exists in the sense that, like, folks expect to go to the university and be safe from people who are not of the university. And why is there that divide in the first place, right? And why do we reinforce that in these ways? And so I think for me, like, this life affirmingness of the university is not only just within the university itself, but also the university being, in right relationship with the community, where we can live, right, interconnected with the folks all around us, right, where public universities, for example, are truly public, and it is available and open and accessible, that the resources are shared, that the investment into the university continues to flow outwards, right, into the community as well. I think that's something that I think about. I think also, just one last piece, I think about, how do we disrupt and change the reality that, for, let's say, for example, a Black student from kindergarten to the end of a PhD, if a PhD is, let's say, takes the longest amount of time of all advanced degrees, from kindergarten to the end of a PhD, a student can be policed at every level, every year of education that they are in the school and also outside of school. And I find that, very, like, tragic, like, frightening when I kind of think about that. And I would like to envision that is not the case, right? That the opposite is that we have the opposite being the case, that instead students from kindergarten to the end of school, to the end of their time in school, are supported, that have all the resources that they need, that their parents are welcome, that their community is welcome at the school, that their school, nurtures the community too in turn as well. And I think, what kind of pipeline, quote unquote, could that look like, and what could that be resulting in if that were the case?
I think this is a really good question for a lot of different reasons. I am thinking about, in my work, right, as a practitioner, when I would meet with students who were essentially being pushed out of the university by the university, I would always ask them, like, what do you need? Like, what's missing? And a lot of times the common narrative that I would hear is that I'm not of this community. And I know that within organizing, something that I've been taught and something that I also relate to the students that I've worked with and have been alongside is, without community, there is no liberation. And our ancestor, well, not our ancestor, but our auntie, Audre Lorde, has, like, taught that and has shared that with us. And I see that as, like, a huge nugget of wisdom of, like, if you do not see yourself as a part of the community, right, like, what type of actual change can happen? And so for me, a police-free campus and abolition movement on a college campus is really about the community. What are the needs of the community? is the community being provided the resources that they need, not only to survive, but to thrive, right? And I don't just think that this is a necessary, it's a must, and it's a part of my dream, right? And so with that, I really think about, what Jude, you mentioned is that a lot of times where universities are situated is that we're just extracting from the community and not necessarily really thinking about how do you take university resources and really put them back into the community. And I would also say that that should be done from a frame and a reference of asking the community what they need, because we see it in research all the time, right? Big bad university comes in and we tell the community what they need. And so if it's truly about a project of liberation, a project of community, thinking about allocating resources in a way that, if the university is not there, how can this community continue to thrive and get the resources that they need to, continue to do what they need? I also, for me, I think community is action oriented and there's a goal. And if liberation for all is not at the center of how the community move forwards, and if everyone's safety is not considered through all points of the action, then it will never ever be sustainable. And so that's been something that I've really been reflecting on, especially being a part of campus movements here at the University of Arizona and working alongside student organizers, is really not only teaching them, but also reflecting of like, what does it mean to care for each other and keep each other safe? And so I know recently a lot of our students have adopted a hashtag that has been on social media, hashtag we keep us safe. And I ask them a lot, when you use that hashtag or when you say we keep us safe, what are you truly, wanting to communicate to the university, right? And we see this, and one of the students actually said is, we see this as hashtag we keep us safe because if the university is going to keep us safe, we know that we can rely on our own community through mutual aid, through networks, right, to get the resources that we need. And I think that that's a way that the university can not only learn, but also think about the ways that if your policy is not working, right, if your practice is not working, if you're saying, oh, we have dining halls on our college campus and only thing a student needs to do is opt into this program, but students are still experiencing food insecurity, students are still experiencing these lack of resources, then students are actually teaching you that these mechanisms that are really grounded in abolition, such as mutual aid, right, trickle down, I mean, not trickle down, really centering the most marginalized, those are the things that, are going to allow students to effectively graduate and go into society and take the resources, right, through leadership development and the things that they've learned with keeping each other safe, to really change policy, not only just on college campuses, but for our whole society. And so I've been privileged to work alongside students and be in community with them. And, I always say, I wish I had, the courage, right, that students currently and students who will continue to come have, because it is a large take in to really push back against the institution, even if you're a student, and also, really wanting to finish and complete your degree.
Well, Brenda, Jude, thank you all so much for everything you've given us in this conversation. I really appreciate those takeaways and really this sort of underlying notion, right, of looking towards students who are always providing the feedback of what needs to happen in order for things to be the way that we imagine them to be. So again, thank you all for your work in this area. Thank you for your contribution to the podcast. For more information and episodes that we have for the Police Free Campus podcast, feel free to visit the Campus Abolition Research Labs website at campusabolition.org. We look forward to hearing from you and seeing more about this work coming out from Jude and Brenda, and inevitably your dissertation, which is going to be amazing. But thank you all so much, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks for having us, Charles.
Thank you for tuning in to the Police Free Campus podcast. I'd also like to thank the National Center for Institutional Diversity and the Anti-Racism Collaborative's Research Community Impact Fellowship, whose generous support made today's production possible. For more information about the Police Free Campus project, or to find resources about reimagining a world without police, visit our project website at policefreecampus.org. If you're interested to learn more about the work at the Campus Abolition Research Lab, consider joining our mailing list by visiting our website at campusabolition.org or following us on Twitter at Campus Abolition. We really, really, really appreciate y'all rocking with us, and we hope to continue to produce content that helps make new worlds possible. So be sure to tell your friends about us, and don't forget to share, like, and comment wherever you're listening to our podcast. Until next time, study, struggle, and peace.